Okay, welcome back. PBS did not want me doing Frank Sinatra, so they cut the microphone, but we persevered. And welcome back after lunch to our next panel on the case for liberal ideas and institutions. I'm delighted to introduce the moderator, who will in turn introduce the panelists. Professor Colleen Sheehan is in our school at Arizona State University as a professor of political science, and she's the director of the Graduate Studies program. She joined us after many years of teaching at Villanova University, and during her years in Pennsylvania, she also served in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives and on the Pennsylvania State Board of Education. She's been an Earhart Fellow, a Bradley Fellow, a Mary and Kennedy Smith Fellow, and a Garwood Fellow at the James Madison Program at Princeton University. Her books include The Mind of James Madison, The Legacy of Classical Republicanism, James Madison and the Spirit of Republican Self-Government, and with Jack Rakoff, she recently co-edited the Cambridge Companion to the Federalist. And her current projects include two book projects, The World of Emma Woodhouse, an interpretation of Jane Austen's Emma, and Madison's America. Please join me in welcoming the panel.
Is this on? This is on? Well, thank you very much, Paul. And if I could, I want to introduce the most wonderful group of graduate students here at SCETL, in this table right over here. So, Putin and Justin Trudeau walk into a bar. I'm just kidding. No, but seriously, Trudeau was asked a question recently about what he would say if he sat down with Vladimir Putin. And before he could even say a word, everybody in the audience just started laughing. So they wouldn't even give him a chance to say anything. I think he was thinking, well, that's not very nice of people kind. You have to be following Trudeau to. I know there's some Canadians in the room. There you go, Trevor. Thank you. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, so this panel is titled "The Case for Liberal Ideas and Institutions." Some of the people on the panel may be making the case for liberal ideas and institutions. Others may be making a slightly different case. We'll see. We have three absolutely brilliant scholars as our panelists today. Professor Michael Zuckert, Professor Dan Mahoney, and Professor Brad Thompson. I'm going to just say a few words about each of them and do the introductions now, and so that when we really get going with their views, we'll just we'll go in the following order: Michael Zuckert, Brad Thompson, and Dan Mahoney is here with us on the big screen. He's our Hollywood celebrity for the evening. So, Michael Zuckert is Nancy Reeves Drew Professor Emeritus at the University of Notre Dame. And he's also the Thomas W. Smith Distinguished Scholar in Residence here at SCETL, and we are thrilled to have him here in that role. Professor Zuckert is a prolific scholar. He's author of numerous books and articles, and when I say numerous, I don't know anyone who can keep up with Michael Zuckert in the last few years, and I mean that with all sincerity. Here are just a few of the things he's written. Launching Liberalism on Lockean Political Philosophy, Natural Rights and New Republicanism, The Natural Rights Republic. And with his better half, Catherine Zuckert, he's written The Truth About Leo Strauss and also Leo Strauss and the Problem of Political Philosophy. Professor Zuckert is also the past editor and I believe founder of the journal American Political Thought. C. Bradley Thompson is a BBT Research Professor of Political Science and Executive Director of the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism at Clemson University. Professor Thompson is author of a very fine book, probably the best book, I think, on John Adams, entitled John Adams and the Spirit of Liberty. He's also written America's Revolutionary Mind, A Moral History of the American Revolution and the Declaration that Defined It. And he's co-author of Neoconservatism, an Obituary for an Idea, just in case you're looking for hints of where people might stand on this panel. Professor Dan Mahoney is Professor Emeritus at Assumption University, and soon to be in the coming fall 2020, the Thomas W. Smith Distinguished Scholar in Residence here with SCETL at ASU. And we are very much looking forward to Professor Mahoney joining us. He's the author of The Conservative Foundations of the Liberal Order, Defending Democracy Against Its Modern Enemies and Immoderate Friends. He's also published a book on Solzhenitsyn, The Ascent from Ideology. And he's co-edited many volumes, including one on Solzhenitsyn's works. Dr. Mahoney is the recipient of the prestigious Raymond Aron Prize, and he's the editor of Perspectives on Political Science. This is indeed an illustrious panel of scholars, all of whom have given a good lifetime of thought to the strengths and weaknesses of liberalism, ancient and modern. They've examined our own polity, America, and its Constitution. What are its guiding principles? And whatever they are they good, or at least good enough? Can they sustain us? Can they ennoble us? Today, there are a number of well-known, or at least vocal intellectuals who claim that liberalism has spent itself, and that the United States of America, as a liberal natural rights republic, is on a downward spiral. This diagnosis reflects more than an ad hoc political and structural weaknesses of the American order. But it's a judgment that the mortal blow is to be found in the philosophy of liberalism itself, that it actually never had a chance, if you understand what it's about. So first, let's ask, is the current predicament about our nation, is our nature in dire straits? If so, is this fundamentally the result of the principles that undergird the polity? And further, is this the fault of liberalism? Finally, is there any hope for renewal? Now, while the three panelists will likely not agree on all the aspects of the causes of our current predicament, they do all seem to think that the situation is very serious, if not critical. Dr. Thompson has said, for example, we are on the verge of lawlessness. And in fact, quote, we might now speak of the disunited states of America, unquote. Dr. Mahoney has described our present predicament as, quote, the suicide of the West, unquote. And I'm not entirely sure how Michael Zuckert would define this. I've looked things up, but I'm sure there's some place where you've spoken on this, but let me say this in the immortal words of P.G. Wodehouse. I'm going to guess that Dr. Zuckert, if not disgruntled, is probably not exactly gruntled about the current situation. So, without further ado, Michael Zuckert.
Thank you, Colleen. I'll try to put my gruntlement on display here. My talk is titled "The Three Pillars of Lockean in paren Liberalism: Locke on Moral Formation." John Locke, by common consent, was the first philosopher of liberalism, and in my opinion, still the greatest. This is not to say that his liberal philosophy is complete, because it's been supplemented by many subsequent thinkers, Montesquieu, Adam Smith, Tocqueville, to name three particularly important ones. But Locke has articulated what I would call the three pillars of liberalism, which I think form the core of a worthy version of a liberal order. Locke's three pillars are not often seen as such because he presented each of them in a separate writing, and nowhere did he put them in one place together with the others. This failing had something to do with the political circumstances in which he worked and wrote, which led him to publish his thoughts on two of these three pillars anonymously. Ironically, the one that he published in a work that he signed remains today the least known of the three. The three are today perhaps best captured under the labels religious toleration, but more broadly toleration, limited government, and education for liberty. But these labels give us little insight into what makes the pillars so solid as they are and what in turn supports them. The central thought that I would identify behind all three pillars is Locke's claim regarding the limits of legitimate coercion. Unlike, for example, Aristotle, who begins by taking for granted the legitimacy of government-wielded coercion, Locke begins and concludes with a demand that coercion requires justification. Having discovered a kind of justification for coercion, he developed a teaching that denies the legitimacy of coercion in religion altogether, from both the point of view of politics and of religion itself. Armed with that same justification for coercion, he developed an account of a non-absolutist, consent-based politics. Finally, armed with this justification, he developed a doctrine of education for the citizens and leaders of this free regime that he had posited in his political writings. Properly understood, we see that Locke's doctrine is not relativist, as is often claimed, not atheistic, as sometimes claimed, and not hyper-individualist, as almost always claimed. With the authentic Lockean liberalism before us, we can then ask, how do our liberal orders relate to his? The answer, I think, is a complex one. On the one hand, we have extended his liberalism in ways, some of which are consistent with and even required, I would argue, or strongly suggested anyway, by his grounding principles. On the other, we have lost sight of some aspects of his position that we ought to reconsider. So my bottom line is that we need to look back to Locke in the first instance and not to pre or non or illiberal sources, as at least one of my fellow panelists, I think, is going to assert. For my presentation today, I'm going to attend exclusively to the third pillar, the Lockean education for liberty. Locke had the idea that as his limited liberal political order did less, the moral character of the citizens counted for more. But unlike classical philosophers, he did not conceive the chief task per se of the political community to be education to virtue, as Aristotle, for example, had it. The chief task of government is rather what Jefferson said in the Declaration of Independence, that being, to secure these natural rights, government are instituted among men. Likewise, given his doctrine of toleration, Locke did not accept the view of many of his Christian predecessors that the political community existed to foster the Christian religion or the salvation of souls. His rejection of these two understandings of the political purpose has led some to conclude that he is indifferent to morality and hostile to religion. Neither, I believe, are correct, but these misunderstandings underlie many of the criticisms that present-day liberalism undergoes. Locke's understanding of morality is partly contained in his two treatises of government in his treatment of the law of nature, and partly in his essay on human understanding in his treatment of moral concepts. But his treatment of moral formation of persons and his more expansive treatment of virtue is contained in his little-read Some Thoughts Concerning Education. This was a treatise on education addressed to a friend and political ally who had sought Locke's advice on raising his children. Interesting, because Locke never had any children. Some of you may know this work as part inspiration and part target for criticism in Rousseau's famous book on education, the Émile. It deserves to be sprung loose, I think, from Rousseau, however, and considered in light of Locke's broader philosophy, and especially of these three pillars that I've mentioned. This Lockean work represents a number of challenges to the reader, the most relevant of which for our purposes today is his dual focus on the one hand, an education suited to any human being living in a free Lockean regime, and second, to the particular class society of his time, to which the addressees of the book and its immediate readership belonged. The first has more universal relevance, of course, but the second is significant, for it indicates that a proper education must be geared not only to human universals, but to social and political particulars. The dual character of the book poses a double task for readers then: to extract the universal from the particular within Locke's presentation, and to then construct a conception of the particular suited to our situation. I do not propose to do that much in my 20 minutes. So I'm going to limit myself to speaking of the Lockean educational universals and of those of only a small piece. In his attempt to give helpful advice to parents and tutors, Locke begins with infancy, a topic on which he had much to say related to his day job as a medical physician. But I will begin elsewhere, with what to Locke's audience must have appeared his most striking deviation from the educational practice of his day: his rejection of the use of physical discipline of any sort. He was most definitely not an adherent to the maxim, "Spare the rod and spoil the child." Indeed, he preached the opposite throughout his book, for he believed that use of the rod did indeed spoil the child. Now, it should be noted that this Lockean innovation in the theory of child rearing is directly related to the underlying thought of his entire system of human institutions, the problematic character of the use of coercion. In his political and religious writings, he emphasizes the issue of the legitimacy of coercion. Because humans are rights-bearing creatures, no one has a right to use coercion against others as a matter of course. To do so is a natural injustice. In his educational book, Locke approaches the issue of coercion somewhat differently, but still negatively. The use of coercion or severe punishment does but very little good, he says, nay, great harm in education. Those children who have been most chastened seldom make the best men. That was Locke. This way of child rearing via chastisement and the rod is, says Locke, the most unfit of any to be used in education. They do not make the best men because the child subject to violence grows into an adult tempted to violence. The child who has been subjected to coercion, that is, that form of mastery by others, develops a desire for mastery of others as a way to avoid the pain of corporal punishment and as a means of compensating for his own suffering. Moreover, the use of physical discipline is counterproductive. Part of Locke's commitment to liberal, that is, free political orders, is based on his insight that human beings, even young children, he says, love their freedom and take great pride in it and in revealing it, showing it to others. Compulsion, especially of the rod, not only causes pain, but is an affront to this love of freedom. The use of compulsion leads to antipathy to those very activities it is meant to encourage. Antipathy not merely of the moment, but long-term. More generally, Locke points out that even milder forms of compulsion lead to resentment and resistance. People just do not like to be told what to do. So Locke would not be at all surprised, although I think he wouldn't agree with it, he wouldn't be surprised at the pushback against the various mandates that we have been experiencing these days. This pushback being motivated by that very pride in freedom that Locke identified. Instead of arousing resistance from the human love of freedom, Locke seeks an education in harmony with it. In general, he seeks the willing rather than the coerced commitment to education, and more broadly, to moral formation. He thus formulates the overall goal of his educational scheme to be, and this is a quotation, to set the mind right so that on all occasions it may be disposed to consent to nothing but what may be suitable to the dignity and excellence of a rational creature. That is, I think we may agree, a very broad and apparently very elevated goal. But what does Locke have in mind when he speaks of what is suitable to the dignity and excellence of a rational creature? Here is one place where Locke's failure to assemble his three pillars in one place diminishes the perception of the coherence and scope of his thought. To fill out what the goal of his educational plan is, we must have recourse to his masterwork, the Essay Concerning Human Understanding. In that book, he identifies the source of all liberty, which is the spring from which his educational theory rises and the basis for his statement on his goal of a proper education. In his chapter in that book on human action and the will, in his essay, Locke identifies that source of all liberty in the power of the mind, this quotation again, to suspend the execution of any of its desires, leaving the mind at liberty to consider the objects of them, examine them on all sides, and weigh them with others. The suspension of the immediacy of desire allows the mind, rather allows reason, to consent to nothing, as he puts it, that is, to no desires but those that are suitable to the dignity and excellence of a rational creature. In the first instance, and what is most relevant at first to Locke's educational system, is the act of suspension and rational judgment itself. The source of all liberty, therefore, is the ability to escape determination by the unexamined passions and to subject our passional life to rational direction. The possibility of freedom, then, depends on the suppression of the importunities of the passions, sufficient that the reason can play its role of consenting to what is compatible with dignity. It falls to a proper education to attend especially to that first task. The child, says Locke, must achieve mastery over his or her inclinations, which is to say, to learn how to resist those importunities of present pleasure or pain for the sake of what reason tells him is fit to be done. The complex act of liberty is not available to the young because their reason is not yet developed enough for it to undertake the second stage of freedom. Herein lies the great apparent peculiarity of Lockean education. The reason of the parents, or later of the tutor, must serve in place of the child's own reason until the child's reason has been trained enough to be capable of taking over the task. That is, the ultimate goal is a free, that is to say, a self-directed, rational individual. Contrary to what might have seemed the case from Locke's objection to the rod and chastisement, this is not actually a permissive education. The reason of the adult educator serves temporarily the task of rendering the child's passions pliant to reason. Without the capacity to suppress and then rationally consent, the child and later the adult lacks the true principle of virtue and industry and is in danger never to be good for anything, says Locke. This habit of resisting the importunities of present pleasure and pain is the true foundation of future ability and happiness, he tells us. This habit, says Locke, is to be inculcated by all the care and ways imaginable by those who have the oversight of the child's education. Herein lies perhaps the deepest stratum of Locke's rejection of education by the rod. Rather than moving the child towards rational suppression of its pleasures and pains, it surrenders to and makes use of the child's antipathy to its present pain. That is to say, it runs counter to the chief aim and goal of the Lockean education. This goal directly contradicts the most common views of Locke's moral and political philosophy. Locke is said by one important philosophic commentator to be part of the moral revolution of modern philosophy, consisting in the emancipation or freeing of the passions. That same commentator identifies Locke as differing only by a hair's breadth from Hobbes. Another almost equally prominent scholar of Locke's political and moral thought identified him as a thinker of possessive individualism, that is, a thinker who saw humanity as marked by an overweening desire to possess external goods, property, and who validated and encouraged that desire. Some version of such views, I believe, motivates the comments of some of the most eminent critics of Locke. So far is Locke from these views that he calls for control of, not surrender to, desires. In particular, he sees the point of his education to be the suppression of the love of power and dominion, the very desires Hobbes had emphasized as primary in human nature. This love of dominion has two chief manifestations: dominion over persons, that is, the desire to have others comply with one's will, and dominion or control over things, that is, the desire to have property. He calls these two forms of love of dominion the roots of injustice and contention. Rather than favoring these two dangerous desires, he calls for the control of them. These are natural propensities and never entirely to be cured or rooted out, but as he says, with art, they may be much mended and turned to good purposes. His goal is not then to license the possessive and masterful sides of human nature, but to bring these under control and to moderate them. His notion of a proper citizen of his free regime is nearly the opposite of what those distinguished commentators have attributed to him. Now, the chief means that Locke recommends to achieve the diminution of the twin desires for mastery is vigorously exacted obedience. A great irony of Locke's education for liberty is, as our earlier speaker, Rita Kaganson, emphasizes in her recent book, the use of strict obedience in order to prepare the child for the exercise of liberty as an adult. This is an education toward autonomy, but it is not one toward do whatever you feel like. So there are certain human tendencies that Locke's education for liberty is designed to counter or at least ameliorate. But there are more positive qualities he seeks as well. Among these are the virtues of courage, justice, curiosity, truthfulness, etc., and something Locke calls breeding. As he describes it, breeding is a quality particularly related to the gentlemanly class of readers he is directly addressing in his little book. But it can be redescribed as a set of qualities well suited to our liberal society. The core of breeding is perhaps what he elsewhere describes as respect and goodwill to all people. On the positive goals of the Lockean education, obviously much more needs to be said, but won't be. Just a word in conclusion of what we might have missed by not attending to Locke's third pillar. We have missed his insight that a society of free persons benefits from a kind of moral character and formation that fits them for individual happiness, good fellowship, and good citizenship. We have especially missed the rather rigorous early education that is prerequisite to this formation. We have missed his conception of how much the achievement of our natural liberty requires something disciplined as its support. And we have missed the ways in which the liberal tradition contains within itself resources to respond to some of the failings of the liberal order as we experience in them. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been 40 years since I was last at Arizona State University. I once hitchhiked here from Colorado as a very young man and slept in the ASU outfield of the baseball diamond for a week, where I was taken care of very kindly by the grounds crew. So I'm delighted to be back.
With a bed this time.
1922, the progressive historian Carl Becker wrote in his famous book on the Declaration of Independence that, quote, "To ask if the principles of the Declaration are true or not is a meaningless question." I disagree. 20 years later, in the wake of Hitler's blitzkrieg across Europe, Becker wrote in a new preface to his book that maybe, just maybe, there are absolute moral truths by which to judge the tyrant. And so too with us in 2022 as Putler's tanks roll into the Ukraine. My objective today is to outline the principles of what I call classical liberalism, Enlightenment liberalism, or the founders' liberalism, and also to explore whether those principles are true and therefore worth defending. I'd like to make the case today for the American Revolution as the highest expression of Enlightenment liberalism, both philosophically and existentially. More specifically, I will argue that the principles of the Declaration of Independence are a précis of the Enlightenment's central tenets. Let me begin by reminding you of exactly what the Declaration says. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Contained in these two sentences is an entire philosophic universe that I'd now like to explore. For instance, what did Jefferson and the signers of the Declaration mean when they used the following philosophic concepts? Necessary or necessity, laws of nature and of nature's God, truth, equality, rights, consent, alter or abolish, which means revolution. Let's start with the Declaration's most philosophic concepts, what we might call its metaphysics and epistemology. What exactly did Jefferson and the Declaration signers mean when they announced, "We hold these truths to be self-evident"? How did they understand the concept truth? This much we know with certainty. American revolutionaries were not epistemological or moral relativists. They did not think that proper moral principles rest on majority opinion, government edict, or subjective whim. Instead, they believed in the capital T in truth, which consists of the following characteristics, including moral truth. It must be objective, absolute, immutable, universal, and permanent. As Noah Webster, the dictionary man, put it, truth is that which is, quote, in conformity to fact or reality, exact accordance with that which is or has been or shall be. Webster's definition of truth assumes a metaphysical reality defined by a certain view of nature. The revolutionary generation, following Sir Isaac Newton, believed that nature is fixed and governed by certain laws of identity and causation. And they knew this by using Francis Bacon's observational, experimental, inductive method, which allowed America's founding revolutionaries to induce certain moral truths and laws, not only about the cosmos, but about human nature and the human condition as well. So, when the Declaration of Independence speaks in the first sentence, as it does, about the laws of nature, it's referring not specifically to Newton's laws of nature, but to certain moral laws of nature, some of which were presented in Locke's second treatise, and some of which they discovered on their own from their direct observation of nature and human nature. In order to better understand how the revolutionaries thought about the moral laws of nature, that is, what they are, how they are known, and what their sanctions are, you might think about this question in the form of an if-given-then conditional imperative. A simple example from the Declaration illustrates the founders' moral reasoning and how an if-given moral imperative works. If you want to continue living in a free and just society, given George III's support of Parliament's unjust laws, then you must take the appropriate actions, namely declaring your independence and fighting a war. In the context of the Declaration, this is a moral law which commands one to act because it is said to be necessary, and the revolutionaries are being impelled to take these actions by the moral logic of their principles. And what are those principles? Let's now turn to Enlightenment liberalism's 4 moral political truths, each of which can be summed up in one word: equality, rights, consent, revolution. Enlightenment liberalism's first truth says, all men are created equal. What did American revolutionaries mean by equality? By equality, they did not mean sameness or egalitarianism. They rejected the idea of what we might call quantitative sameness. They did not think that all men are or should be equal in all respects. They recognized the existence of various measurable inequalities between men and women. They recognized a hierarchy of talents and abilities. Jefferson and Adams spoke often of the existence of a natural aristocracy. So, if men are metaphysically unequal, at least in certain respects, the obvious question is, how or in what way are they equal? The revolutionaries accepted the view that all men share what we might call qualitative sameness, or what John Locke called species equality, which means that all men share common attributes, namely, most importantly, reason and free will, that distinguish them from all other species. Given these fundamental and distinguishing qualities, the revolutionary generation believed that men are and must be, therefore, self-owning and self-governing. How then are they equal? The Founding Fathers believed that individuals are equal in their right to be free, free from the arbitrary will of others, and free from their unchosen obligations to others. This means that no man is by nature the master of another, and no man is by nature the slave of another. As Jefferson once famously put it, because Sir Isaac Newton was superior to others in understanding, he was not therefore lord of the person or property of others. In sum, by equality, the revolutionaries meant that individuals are equally free, or they are equal in their rights. Let's turn now to the Enlightenment liberalism's second truth, which states that men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Rather than focus on the particular rights listed in the Declaration, namely life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, what I'd like to do is take a broader view and explicate how the revolutionary generation understood the very idea rights. The principle of unalienable or natural rights served a twofold purpose for the revolutionaries. First, as the standard by which to measure and judge the actions of king and parliament during the years of the imperial crisis. And second, as the moral foundation upon which to build their constitutional structures and political institutions in the years after 1776. Sometimes the revolutionaries spoke of natural rights, the rights of nature, or unalienable rights. By this they meant that rights are not given to men as a gift by government or society. The source of these rights is nature, and most of the founders believed that God was the source of nature and hence of man's rights, although not all did. Over the course of the 11 years of the imperial crisis, American colonists came to reject the idea of the so-called rights of Englishmen, which are the particular rights of a particular people at a particular place and at a particular time. In the years after the Stamp Act, the colonists launched a search to discover a standard of justice that was absolute, permanent, and universal. The revolutionaries' doctrine of rights provided them with a natural standard of right and wrong that defined and protected man's moral requirements to live and live well in the context of civil society. natural rights are moral principles that serve as both a license and offense to protect man's freedom in a social context. The rights of nature recognize certain facts of the human condition. One, that it is necessary and right for individuals to freely exercise their rational faculty. Two, that it is necessary and right that men be free to choose and pursue actions that support their lives. Three, that it is necessary and right for individuals to acquire, use, and dispose of property. Four, that it is necessary and right to pursue the values required for human flourishing. America's deepest revolutionary thinkers understood the concept rights to be a moral principle, that is, a specific kind of identification of what freedom is, the freedom to think and act, and why it is good and right. Let's now turn to Enlightenment liberalism's third truth, which states that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now, this is a complex truth that says three things at least. First, that the sole purpose of government is to protect the rights of individuals. Its purpose is not to make men equal in possessions, nor to make them morally good. It is to protect their rights as individuals, period. It says nothing more and nothing less. Second, that limited constitutional government is necessary to secure rights. This principle is obviously not stated in the Declaration, but I think it is certainly inferred. And third, that government is grounded on the consent of the people, which means the people are sovereign. While any non-tyrannical form of government can protect individual rights, the revolutionary generation believed that the republican form of government and its many variations was the best form of government to achieve its legitimate ends. Finally, we turn to Enlightenment liberalism's fourth truth, which says that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. What I'm calling the right to revolution is a complex truth that is not so self-evident. In fact, it's not self-evident at all, at least not in the traditional sense of self-evident, but that's a discussion for another day. The truthiness of the revolution truth is built on, and it is the culmination of, each of the previous three truths. Built into the revolution truth is the consent truth, the rights truth, and the equality truth. They are the philosophic antecedents which make the revolution truth possible. The right to revolution is, to be clear, a fundamental right of a free people. It is a core principle of Enlightenment liberalism. But it is not a principle of anarchic subjectivism. The right to revolution, rightly understood, must first establish the conditions by which revolution, which means armed rebellion and violence, is justified. To be invoked, the revolution truth demands that certain objective criteria be established and that evidence be brought to bear that proves the existence of tyranny or a clear-cut design to establish tyranny. The Declaration of Independence does exactly that. It says, but when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. The Declaration then lays out in lawyerly-like fashion 18 charges against George III. American revolutionaries were not philosophers. They were Americans, which is better than to be a philosopher. to their ever-living glory. To their ever-living glory, they united theory and practice. They acted on their convictions. They dedicated their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to the cause of a free society. As I conclude, I'd like to return for a moment to the Declaration's first sentence, which says, "When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another." Why was separation, which means war and death, said to be necessary, if not a duty? Necessary means that it must be, but surely necessary does not mean inevitable or predetermined. American revolutionaries had a choice, and they chose war. The fact that they deemed the decision to fight as necessary says something about their moral constitutions. American revolutionaries would permit no breach between theory and practice, ideas and actions, words and deeds. They were moral absolutists, not just in theory, but in theory and practice. Moral necessity demanded of the colonists that they act in a certain way, that is, with vigilance, integrity, and courage, given their chosen values, for example, justice and freedom. Failure to do so would mean a concession to tyranny, which would result in their oppression and then enslavement. The Declaration of Independence announced to the world that the Americans could not and would not renounce their most deeply held convictions. It also said that they must act on their chosen values. They are impelled by necessity to choose independence. American revolutionaries permitted themselves no breach between their principles and practice. They practiced what they preached. The words written by John Adams to a friend during some of the darkest days of the Revolution serve as a kind of motto to describe who they were as men and as patriots. Fiat justitia ruat caelum. Let justice be done though the heavens should fall. The decision and actions taken by American patriots represents, I think, a heroic integration of mind and body. The virtue of integrity was the linchpin that united theory and practice in the revolutionaries' moral universe. They held their principles as moral absolutes, and they attempted to practice them without compromise or contradiction. They chose to act in ways they thought right and just, regardless of the immediate consequences, precisely because they understood the value of acting in their long-term self-interest. If integrity is the principle of being principled, then the revolutionary generation embodied the virtue in spades. They did not evade, rationalize, turn the other cheek, or shirk their commitment or responsibility to their highest values. Instead, they responded in thought and deed to the repeated violations of their rights by organizing boycotts, protesting and resisting usurpations, writing letters, petitions, and remonstrances, liberating boxes of tea, and eventually going to war. American revolutionaries were rebels with a cause. The moral universe they inhabited might seem like a foreign place to 21st century Americans, but we forget its moral lessons at our peril. Their revolution is surely one of history's greatest monuments to human virtue. It is ours to remember and celebrate. And as the good book says, let us now praise famous men and the fathers that begat us. Thank you.
So Dan, we've had 3 pillars of liberalism, and then we had 4 pillars of liberalism. And so I'm wondering if you're going to weigh in on 3.5 pillars of liberalism. Dan Mahoney.
I'm going to weigh in on liberalism and its limits, not just its limits, it has a place, but I don't think our civic and civilizational inheritance is reducible to liberalism, nor do I think that the American project is best understood as a kind of epiphenomenal reflection of the principles of early modern political philosophy. But I'm just as interested in defending our civic and civilizational inheritance as my two fellow panelists. It seems to me today that the West is haunted by a specter of self-loathing, which is increasingly nihilistic and fanatical. And of course, in any time and place, friends of ordered liberty have to be wary about various forms of political authoritarianism and collectivism coming from the left and the right. But that doesn't seem to me to be our fundamental threat today. That fundamental threat is connected to the fact that nearly the entire intellectual class, not only in America, but in the Western world more broadly, bristles at the suggestion that we, in the freest, most prosperous, most self-critical society in the history of the world, have a patrimony that is worth preserving. I just want to go back a little bit to remind people in the audience, especially younger people, that if you look, for example, at least at the rhetoric that inspired democratic statesmen during World War II, and let's say for the first decade or two of the long Cold War, it seems to me that our Western peoples, democratic peoples, had a more capacious understanding of what they were defending. They were defending the West, a term that's barely part of our political consciousness today. Sometimes people talked about the free world, but at least for a time, there was a widespread emphasis on the broad continuity of Western civilization, including the classical and Christian traditions and constitutionalism, ancient and modern. And in recent decades, especially since the 60s, we, our elites, and increasingly the ordinary discourse of democratic political life has emphasized in a much more narrow way democracy, capitalism, human rights, and especially the autonomy of the individual. So this is a long way from somebody like Winston Churchill and his great finest hour speech, at the beginning of the Battle of Britain, June 18, 1940, where he linked the continuity of the British Empire and British parliamentary democracy with what he freely called Christian civilization. And he said that if Hitler's barbarous pagan racialism was to triumph, it would inaugurate, quote, a new dark age made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. A few days before, Paul Hainaut, the last prime minister of the French Third Republic, said, if the Nazis win, we will have the Middle Ages without mercy. And even a statesman like Franklin Roosevelt often spoke about Nazism imperiling liberal and Christian civilization. George Orwell, in his great wartime essay, still well worth reading, The Lion and the Unicorn, said that the English people, and even some of their intellectuals, were too residually Christian to be taken in by the power worship of totalitarian intellectuals on the continent. Although he knew that Britain had its share of intellectuals on the right, but mainly on the left, in the case of the Soviet Union, who engaged in such fellow traveling or a kind of admiration for regimes that, with their 5-year plans and making the trains run on time, et cetera, et cetera. And also, wartime statesmen like Churchill and de Gaulle spoke about the necessity of cultivating classical virtues, especially civic and martial courage. Churchill often spoke about Christian ethics as being an essential partnership with the fundamental liberties of English law and parliamentary democracy. there was a kind of fusionism here, I would say, of the liberties of free men and women with a broader moral, religious, and civilizational inheritance. That's not to say that what we're defending is not in some crucial respect rightly called liberal intellect, a liberal civilization. And I think one of the real problems with hyper-politicized or ideological intellectuals in the 20th century is they did give way to what the great French historian Francois Furet called anti-bourgeois ire. In a word, they could imagine nothing worse than what Tocqueville called the decent materialism of bourgeois democratic society. And in their contempt for democratic mediocrity, they forgot what the British conservative philosopher Roger Scruton had called liberal democracies, and I quote, features which are or ought to be the envy of the world, the rule of law and the right of property, so indispensable to political liberty, and the exercise of virtues such as liberality and generosity, monogamous marriage, attacked by people like Foucault as the bourgeois family, universal citizenship and education, and Scruton added the prosperity and security provided by science and the market, the two inevitable byproducts of individual freedom. But this liberalism was always a liberalism that was rooted in what Tocqueville in the Ancien Régime of the Revolution called liberty under God and the laws. And I would say that sort of living, practical embodiment of liberal institutions and liberal practices was as fundamental as some of the theoretical sources of liberalism, which were often more radical in their trajectory and underlying presuppositions. And of course, as we know, beginning in the 1950s and 60s, bourgeois liberty and the Christian inheritance both came under assault from a liberationist or emancipatory ethic that reduced all authority to authoritarianism, that increasingly separated liberty from law and self-restraint, and at the intellectual level became defenders of what Roger Scruton also calls the heresy of domination, a form of nothing buttery, where law is nothing but power, where family is nothing but male patriarchal sexual assertion, where a teacher conveying wisdom is nothing but an authoritarian master, et cetera, et cetera. And I think this heresy of domination, which has taken deep form in the academy and in the commanding heights of the culture, is deeply destructive, both of our liberal heritage, but also of the traditions, institutions, and practices that are so essential to the operation of a decent and free political order. We reach a point now where we treat biological sex, the sexual binary itself, as nothing but a social construction. So we're in the grips of what Scruton also very felicitously and suggestively called a culture of repudiation. And this culture of repudiation takes aim both at our liberal inheritance, but also, you might say, of the broader moral inheritance that for a long time gave impetus and life to the freedoms that are so essential to rule of law societies. We have our freedom, but what are we going to do with our freedom? And perhaps liberalism doesn't provide enough guidance to how saying we're rights bearers tells us very little about who the human being is, who this X is who has rights. So I would say today, in light of this crisis I've alluded to, it's important for us to emphasize more openly, more directly, some of the presuppositions of our framers and the other architects of modern liberal democracy, presuppositions that they could largely take for granted. One of those was the national or territorial framework of a self-governing people or nation. And I think that's under fundamental assault from an increasingly radicalized cosmopolitanism, which is the dominant ethos in intellectual life today, and certainly in the universities. I think we have to defend the founders' achievement by articulately self-consciously articulating the larger framework of liberty implicit in their political philosophizing and constitution making. So when they affirmed rights, they always assumed that rights bearers were free men and women charged with responsibilities and obligations inherent in the very exercise of freedom. Madison very nobly speaks about the sacred character of conscience in a document like the Memorial and Remonstrance. Well, I think we have to remind people in a much more vigorous way that conscience, so integral to liberty, to the moral life and human dignity rightly understood, is never to be confused with mere self-will or what C.S. Lewis called the poison of subjectivism. What's Locke's role in all of this? There's much, I think, that is admirable and choice-worthy in the liberalism of Locke, but there's much that is problematic from the point of view of the higher fusionism that I think is at the source of the success of rule of law regimes in the West over the last few centuries. Locke, for example, did, I think, finally reduce things to the great desideratum of comfortable self-preservation. He quietly, but not so quietly, rejected the beneficence of nature and God's providential order. It was perhaps not so bad to bet on the rational industrious rather than the quarrelsome and contentious, but I think he problematically defined the moral life as the flight from evil, the unending flight from evil. He denied intrinsic goods that might culminate in a highest way of life, a sunum bonum, and his accounts of denial of innate ideas and accounts of mixed modes in the essay concerning understanding gives rise to, or at least can give rise to, a kind of nihilistic moral constructivism. So it's no accident that his eminent student, the third Earl of Shaftesbury, suggested that Locke's thought was imbued with a skepticism that undermined the moral life and therefore decent political community. And that view was shared, I think, by James Wilson, one of the American founders, in his law lectures at the University of Pennsylvania in the early 1790s, where he wondered if Locke wasn't more of an Epicurean and Hobbesian than a Christian gentleman. Again, I'm not here to condemn Locke, but I do think we have to remind ourselves that Locke not only had a very significant impact on the American Revolution. There's that wonderful French phrase, the bon usage de, the good uses of. It seems to me the English and American revolutionaries made very good use of Locke, and they didn't particularly emphasize some of the darker underpinnings that were capable of radicalization down the line. But John Courtney Murray, for example, and We Hold These Truths, reminds us that Locke had a major and perhaps pernicious impact on the French Revolution through his psychology, through the essay, as it was applied and amplified and radicalized philosophically and politically by the encyclopedists. I'm not with Patrick Deneen and those who want to blame everything problematic in our present liberal order on the poison pill of Lockeanism, but I do think that we have to ask ourselves whether classical liberalism, Lockean liberalism, in and of itself has those self-limiting capacities to help keep what Eric Voegelin in the New Science of Politics called modernity without restraint at bay. There's one other issue I want to raise, and that is the difficulty that a certain kind of liberalism has in placing a brake on the endless self-radicalization of human rights. I'm going to draw here in an argument that Pierre Menant makes much better than I can in his recent book, Natural Law and Human Rights. He says, look, free societies depend on healthy, authoritative institutions that are in decisive respect self-governing and autonomous. But when ill-considered right claims undermine the animating purposes of those authoritarian institutions, then perhaps the liberal order itself is threatened. So when institutions such as the Catholic Church is told it has to ordain women as priests, both religious and secular progressives insist, and reject its age-old understanding of sexual morality to accommodate the rights of those who in no way share its own self-understanding. Likewise, universities must restrict the search for truth to accommodate the therapeutic demands of those insisting on safe spaces, little 18-year-old Jacobins, or ideologues committed to the extirpation of our civilizational inheritance. And the armed forces must accommodate the felt needs of those suffering gender dysphoria, regardless of the effects on the cohesion of those troops as an integral fighting force. So I come here not to condemn Locke or liberalism, but to say the logic of the ideology of human rights is very real. It can give rise to a very illiberal social engineering, which becomes the order of the day, even to a moral antinomianism that eventually trumps the autonomy of civil society in the name of the autonomous individual, unbeholden to the common good, the moral law, the goods of life. So these indiscriminate rights claims of the least thoughtful, the least moderate, the most vociferous, end up superseding all other intellectual, political, and moral considerations. And I think that's where we are today to a large extent. So I would say, do I want to blame that on the poison pill of Locke? No, I think that would be a terrible simplification. In conclusion, let me add, my critique has nothing to do with the integralists, who I consider foolish people who are fiddling while Rome burns, scribbling in dreamland, and preoccupying themselves with literary politics. The Papal States were the worst governed states in Europe, not governed tyrannically, just governed poorly. There's no evidence that the church can provide any but salutary indirect guidance on how free men and women exercise their liberties and virtues. And I don't think a confessional state is possible today, and I certainly don't think it is desirable. I think politics has a rhyme and rhythm of its own and an autonomy that men of faith ought to respect, but do their best to inform in terms of the character and the virtues of free men and women who are also open to the truth of belief. So what's the one thing needful today? I don't think it's exactly a resuscitation of theoretical liberalism. We need to recover at least a clear, and here what I agree with Brad, a clearer understanding of the intrinsic and dialectical links between truth and liberty. And perhaps we need to recover a philosophical faith rooted in a much clearer distinction between truth and falsehood and good and evil. Raymond Aron, one of my intellectual heroes, said in the last essay he wrote, that is a terrible mistake to identify freedom with vulgar hedonism. And I'll end on this note. In a free and decent society, All men and women should be given wide scope to choose their own way in life, but not to invent their own arbitrary tablets of good and evil. And on a hopeful note, I might suggest that liberalism at its best and most sober and the old moral capital of the West can surely be agreed that in that particular affirmation. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dan, Michael, and Brad. So we have two folks who essentially came not to bury Locke, but to praise him, and a third who comes not to condemn Locke, but certainly not to praise him too much. I want to say one quick word for those of you who might be wondering why there's been so much focus on Locke when we're talking about what is the future of America and in terms of liberalism, and then ask the panelists if they want to respond to each other where they might see points of agreement or disagreement. But for those of you who haven't done maybe quite as much work in this, Locke, the focus on Locke looking at America, the point of contention has to do with whether Locke represents Hobbes's ideas of essentially that the idea of the laws of nature are rationalizations of our self-interest, that self-preservation is the fundamental basis of a political regime. Or did the American founders, when they invoked Locke, understand Locke more in the tradition of Hooker, maybe even going back to Thomas Aquinas, and the idea not of a Hobbesian laws of nature, but more the idea of a hierarchy of human goods. And so the ends of America were ultimately decent, perhaps even noble, as opposed to the sort of Hobbesian Machiavellian lowering of the standards of political and human life. So that's a quick shorthand to ask you all to be thinking about what is the character of this land we call America. And so the invoking of Locke has everything to do with how we judge our political order. What is it that's worth retaining? What is it that we perhaps need to get rid of or at least improve in order to go forward? So, Michael, let's maybe we can start with you. Do you want to respond at all to Brad or Dan?
Okay, I have a few things I could say to all of them, to you included. I think your drawing of the alternatives, is Locke Hobbes or is Locke Thomas Aquinas? I just don't think he's either of them. He's neither Hobbes nor Thomas Aquinas. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that. He's not Hobbes or Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas is grounded in a sort of theology that Locke does not deploy. So, among other things, Thomas Aquinas did not have a doctrine of religious toleration and such Locke has. And that's an important, I mean, there are really important differences. Locke, the most characteristic thoughts of Locke are not the thoughts of Thomas Aquinas. So I'll leave it at that. With regard
in terms of the moral basis.
Well, I mean, I think Locke had a different moral understanding than Thomas, but I think it's wrong to say that unless you're a Thomist, you don't have a moral understanding. I think Locke had a moral understanding. I tried to lay out some of it. Obviously, I could only talk about a bit of it, but this would be in reply to Dan. Dan, for example, says, I mean, he said many things that one would want to speak to, but don't have time to speak to all of it. But that, for example, that Locke amounts merely to the position of comfortable self-preservation. I thought I gave in my talk an indication that's just not true. For Locke, the standard of good action, of human action, is action, free action in accord with the dignity of a rational being. That strikes me as not the same as comfortable preservation. I do have one comment about Brad's paper. Actually, I was surprised when he said this. Brad,
Michael?
you
Gentlemen?
spoke at the end of your paper as the founders having acted in regard or in accord with their given chosen values. Now that suggests chosen values suggest something different other than a commitment to the truth of these things. So I'd like you to comment on that.
By values, I simply meant principles.
No, I'm rethinking more to chosen.
Chosen, all right, flesh that out for me.
Well, I mean, if it's something that's chosen, what seems to be important is the chosenness of it, that they've made a decision in favor of it. And that seems not to be consistent with the idea we hold these truths to be self-evident.
No, but the chosen part comes in the choice to fight, the choice to separate. So the argument that I tried to make in my paper is that they regarded certain moral truths to be true, to be absolutely certain, permanent, universally true. But the question then is, how do you reconcile theory with practice? How do you reconcile truth with human action? And human action is always a choice. And in the context of July 4th, 1776, they had a choice. A third of all Americans were in favor of revolution, a third, or independence and war, a third were opposed to independence and war, and a third were in the middle. And the fact of the matter is, in 1776, they had to make a choice. And they made the choice to live, or at least most American revolutionaries made the choice to live according to their moral principles. So that's what I mean by choice.
Okay. Could I say that I think the formulation that I heard you say was something like, given their chosen values? I would say what you're saying was chosen were the actions that they took on the basis of moral truths that as they understood them. But the formulation that you gave is rather different.
Right, but even principles have to be chosen, right? Principles don't exist as floating abstractions. You can choose principles that are true. You can choose principles that are not true. The fact is, they chose principles that they regarded and then, to a large degree, substantially defended as true.
Okay.
That's what I mean.
Okay.
Can I?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I'd like to say something just maybe for the students in the audience. We have to understand that that what we're talking about in certain ways, and we don't want to confuse them, are two liberalisms. There are two liberalisms, maybe more than two liberalisms. But in sort of the longue durée of American history, the two liberalisms are what Michael and I have been talking about: Lockean liberalism, the founders' liberalism, classical liberalism, as opposed to modern 20th century progressive liberalism. And never the twain shall meet. I regard those two liberalisms to be fundamentally, philosophically different. And the part of the challenge that I have with the new reactionary right in the United States is that they want to argue that the founders, or the founders' liberalism, the liberalism of 1776, ultimately leads to not just 20th century progressive liberalism, but to 21st century nihilist liberalism. This is not true. It is a false teaching. They are philosophical. They are almost philosophical opposites, right? So it's important to make this distinction. I do not think, for instance, that Thomas Jefferson leads to the new left. I do not think that the principles of the Declaration lead to drag queen story hour, which is what some members of the reactionary right are now arguing in this country. The attempt to make one liberalism from the founders to the 21st century. This is simply not true. The founders' liberalism does not lead to nihilism, as some want to argue.
Dan, would you like to comment on either one of the panelists?
Yes, by the way, to come back to the question of choice, And here I'm going to say, I think Brad is not defending the sort of Sartrean or existentialist view of the engagé intellectual, that things are good because they're chosen, but rather that these principles have to be affirmed and fought for in the revolution and the struggle against tyranny, etc. And those are two, I think, very different moral stances, even if they share a common word. But you know that you listen to someone like Sartre, you must be engaged. Well, you can be engaged to anything. You can be engaged in the service of Nazism or cannibalism or whatever. Why engage the engagé, the act of engagement or choice in and of itself is coextensive with what's right, is, it seems to me, an absolute non sequitur. Yeah, about Locke, Michael, I don't want to join the parade of people, whether it's McPherson reducing Locke to possessive individualism, or Patrick Deneen and reducing him to the evisceration of all public spirit and the loss of a moral horizon altogether. I do think those are simplifications. I think there's some virtue in industriousness and rationality in the Lockean sense. I think that I look at the situation in Canada and I see a progressivist post-national state, trying to crush the sort of Lockean spirit of the truckers, for whom I have real sympathy. But I would just add that, Leo Strauss was onto something when he emphasized that an effectual truth, or at least a vulgarization of Locke's more high-minded political philosophy and political psychology, would be something like the joyless quest for joy. And I don't think that's wrong. And it's not to say that that was Locke's single-minded intent, but it is to say there was a howling out of human motives, the sort of rich motives of the human soul. And there was also what you could call a desubstantialization of man. That's what I meant when I said, with Locke, you have much more clarity about what the rights are, and you have a much thinner understanding of who the human person is. And I do think that is a problem when addressing the issue I raised in my presentation about the propensity of liberalism to give rise to ever more imprudent, radicalized rights that often eat away at crucial traditions and institutions and presuppositions within liberal civil society that are also very essential for the healthy operation of free and decent societies. So, and yes, it is true, coming back to Colleen's point, that the founders like James Wilson and Alexander Hamilton in his famous The Farmer Refuted from February 23, 1775, that's the one where he takes on Hobbes for really for nihilism, for denying an intelligent superintending principle who is the governor and will be the final judge of the universe. So if that's what the state of nature meant, a denial of a superintending principle of the good or some providential order above the human will, Hamilton rejected it. I think there were other founding fathers who would have rejected that understanding of state of nature theory. But they generally said, well, Locke's not like that. Did they study Locke very closely? No. I think they used Locke for their own purposes. I'd say the Declaration of Independence. It was, as Jefferson said in a final letter in 1826, an expression of the American mind and the great books of natural and public right, Aristotle, Cicero, Sidney, and Locke. Its tone is high-minded and even aristocratic. Its emphasis on rights is clearly Lockean. Its theology is both deistic and theistic. Theistic when it three times appeals to God as providence and judge, etc. And the peroration is clearly an appeal to a kind of magnanimity that is compatible with the defense of civil and political liberty. So even the Declaration I read is not simply a kind of standardization of Enlightenment themes, but as a very noble and eloquent, and yes, coherent, but nonetheless, it's not an epiphenomenalization of the Enlightenment project. It's an expression of an American mind in which liberalism was one element, perhaps officially the dominant element, but maybe not the animating element. You know, who fights and dies, you know, for liberty, you know, who risks their, you know, life, their sacred honor, their life, if you know, even our obligations of duty have to bow before self-preservation, as they do in the opening chapters of the second treatise. So, but I'm interested today, and this might separate me from my two deeply thoughtful colleagues. I think our task is less to come up with a genealogy of the American political order, what thinkers influenced the founders and all that. I'm much more interested now in what emphases, ideas, presuppositions allow us to stabilize, correct, elevate, and sustain the liberal order. And in my view, that necessarily will entail an emphasis on and a recovery of important pre-liberal, pre-modern influences that are, you know, clearly not as strong as they used to be, but we have no alternative to make a serious effort to recover a more substantial understanding of the moral contents of life. Because rights, as important as they are to the preservation of liberty, are thin in that they don't tell us much or anything about who the human person is and what kind of life a decent or noble or virtuous person lives. So I don't want to succumb to anti-bourgeois ire. We've seen what they led to in the totalitarian ideologies of the 20th century. I think the interglyphs don't know how to think or act politically. They suffer from a terrible nostalgia. You know, they dream of some confessional state that never existed. Maybe Salazar's Portugal or Dollfuss's Austria in the 1930s, a Catholic corporate authoritarianism, was a heck of a lot better than Nazism or fascism and communism. But I think we in American Britain can do better than that. You know, I say that to my fellow fevered post-liberal Catholic friends. But I don't think the choice is Locke or integralism. I think the choice is strengthening our civic and civilizational inheritance by drawing on all the resources necessary to sustain liberty under God and the laws.
Thank you, Dan. We only have a few minutes left, but we did start a few minutes late. So if Dr. Carice will allow us one question. And I think Diana Schaub has that question.
This is to Brad, but maybe also to the other two. I liked your explication of the moral absolutes, the principles of the Declaration of Independence. I found it very rousing. But there was one concept or word that you left out, and that's the word prudence. And it's right after that listing of the principles that the founders say, prudence indeed will dictate. Government's long established, not be overthrown for light and transient reasons. So the way you spoke, it was if, you know, we've got our principles, we just go directly to action. So this is in a way related to what Michael had to say, too, about choice. I mean, what I'm wondering is what guidance can prudence give us? And in a way, this is maybe a debate here. You are all prudent individuals, where are our best resources? Michael tells us Locke can still be a resource for us. Dan says we've got to look back a little bit earlier to find these resources. So, maybe one thing that contemporary liberalism has lost is the notion of the virtue of prudence.
I agree entirely, and late last night, prudence is the word I had to cut out of my talk to get this down to a reasonable length, which, no. Prudence is the first word after the end of the listing of the fourth self-evident truth is prudence, right? And so Jefferson is quite clear, both in the Declaration and in his summary view, that prudence requires us to determine a design, right? You don't revolt, you don't get into armed conflict because Parliament passes one bad law. Right, and Jefferson in the summary view says, over the course of the 18th century, every 20 years or so, Parliament would pass a bad law, the Fur Act, the Iron Act, but none of those single acts led to revolution. The Stamp Act in and of itself, had that been the last bad law passed by Parliament, would not have been sufficient to lead to revolution. But when a long train of abuses, right, that occur over a very short period of time, when you go from the Sugar Stamp Declaratory Townsend Tea coercive prohibitory acts within an 11-year period, you can detect a design, a pattern to enslave a people. But even then, prudence is required because, you have to take into account several things. There's no point leading a revolution if it's going to be crushed on the first day, right? You have to have some consideration for actually winning. And so it's partly a question of prudence is in part a question of timing. When is the best time in which to revolt? First you have to determine if it's justified, and if it is justified, then you have to determine whether it's practical or not to engage in action against the government. Right, the same thing happened over the course of the last few weeks in Canada. Right, and which, by the way, I think the truckers showed a great deal of prudence in the way they dealt with the Canadian government. So yes, bottom line, yes, prudence is the necessary condition for rational revolution.
Speaking of timing, please join me in thanking Professors Dan Mahoney, Michael Zuckert, and Brad Thompson.
Thank you.
Thank you to the whole panel. Sorry, Dan, I know you would have wanted to say things about prudence, but next time we'll do that. So we're running.
There's always time to talk about prudence.
That's
so
right.
we'll pick it up later.
Great. We are running a little bit late, so let's start again at 3:20 with our panel on a civic compact for our digital age. I hope you'll stick around not only for that, but for our keynote address and dialogue